My name is Cora Hemlock. At 72, I find that life has a way of sanding you down, smoothing the sharp edges of youth until what's left is a person you both recognize and feel is a stranger. My Silas passed on 6 months ago, and the silence in our little house in Willow Creek has since become a presence of its own, a quiet guest that sits in his favorite armchair and watches me go about my days. He was the sturdy oak of my life. I was the ivy that wound around him, and now, without his strength, I often feel I'm just drifting. I suppose that's why I pinned so much hope on Christmas. For weeks, I'd been planning a grand dinner. Not grand in a showy sense, but grand in its intention. I wanted to gather the fragments of our family and see if we could piece them together, even for one evening. I wanted to feel the warmth of belonging, a warmth that had grown faint since Silas's passing. The reservation was at the Silver Pen, a place Silas and I had always spoken of visiting but never had. It was nestled in the city's historic district, famous for its soft lighting and the hushed reverence with which the staff treated both the food and the patrons. I'd paid a $500 deposit for a table for 7, myself, my 3 children and their partners, and my grandson, Finn. It was more money than I should have spent, but I told myself that the memory would be worth more than any figure on a bank statement. I was trying to buy back a feeling, a time when family felt like a safe harbor rather than a collection of distant ships passing in the night. The day of the dinner, a nervous energy thrummed beneath my skin. I chose my dress with the care of a young woman preparing for her first dance, a deep emerald velvet that Silas had always said matched the flecks of green in my eyes. The silver locket he'd given me for our 40th anniversary felt cool against my throat. As I fastened the clasp, my hands trembled. I told myself it was anticipation. It wasn't. It was the old, familiar fear of disappointment, a fear I'd been trying to outrun my entire life. The calls began in the early afternoon, a well-rehearsed symphony of excuses. First came Isabel, my eldest, her voice a polished veneer of concern. "Mother, I'm so terribly sorry. Little Clara has a dreadful cough, and we simply can't risk bringing her out in this cold. You understand, don't you?" Clara was my granddaughter, a sweet girl I hadn't seen in nearly 4 months. Isabel's tone was a masterpiece of feigned empathy, one she had perfected over decades. It made me feel unreasonable for wanting anything at all. "Of course, dear," I murmured, the words tasting like ash. "Give her a hug for me. Is there anything you need?" No, we're all set. We'll have to do this again soon. Promise." A promise from Isabel was as fleeting as a soap bubble. 20 minutes later, my son Martin called. "Mom, you won't believe it. A pipe burst in the basement. There's water everywhere. I've got to deal with this." "I'm so sorry." Martin, ever the pragmatist, always had a crisis that was just concrete enough to be believable, but too inconvenient to verify. "What about Diane and the children?" I asked, picturing his wife and my other 2 grandchildren. "Oh, they've gone over to Isabel's to help out with Clara. Keep the other kids entertained while she rests. You know how it is." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "They're all together." "I see," I said, my voice small. The final nail was delivered by Julian, my youngest, whose life was a perpetual series of minor catastrophes. "Mom, my car won't start. The roadside assistant says it could be hours. I feel awful." His apology was breathless, almost convincing. I sat in my quiet living room, the emerald velvet of my dress absorbing the dim afternoon light. 3 children, 3 perfectly timed excuses. The precision of it was a cruelty all its own. For a moment, I considered taking off the dress, making a pot of tea, and letting the evening dissolve into the silence. But the thought of sitting alone in the house, surrounded by Silas's absence, felt more unbearable than sitting alone in a crowded restaurant. I had already paid the deposit. The dress was already on. And a small, stubborn part of me refused to let their casual disregard completely erase my evening. So I went. The Silver Pen was even more beautiful than I had imagined. It glowed with warmth, the air filled with the low hum of happy conversations and the clinking of glasses. The hostess, a young woman with kind eyes, gave me a look of gentle pity when I confirmed that the reservation for 7 would now be for 1. Would you prefer a smaller table, ma'am? She asked softly. No, I said, my voice surprising me with its steadiness. This one is fine. I sat at the large, empty table, a solitary island in a sea of celebration. I ordered a glass of the Pinot Noir Silas had loved, its deep red color a stark contrast to the crisp white tablecloth. I ordered an appetizer for the empty seat beside me and another for the one across from me. I was trying to fill the space with food because I could not fill it with people. The weight of it all finally broke me when I glanced at the table next to mine. A family, spanning 3 generations, was laughing, their faces illuminated by candlelight and genuine affection. The grandmother sat at the head of the table, not as an afterthought, but as the sun around which they all orbited. She was listened to, cherished. A tear escaped, then another. They traced slow, hot paths down my cheeks. I fumbled in my purse for a tissue, trying to be discreet, when the heavy oak door of the restaurant burst open, letting in a gust of frigid winter air. A figure stood silhouetted against the night. Then he was running, weaving through the tables with an urgency that turned heads. Grandma Cora. It was Finn, my grandson. His 17-year-old face was flushed, his dark hair a mess from the wind. He wore a thin jacket, clearly not warm enough for the December chill, as if he'd left in a great hurry. Finn. I stood up confused. What are you doing here? I thought you were with your mother. He reached my table, breathing hard, his eyes bright with an emotion I couldn't quite place, anger, sorrow, determination, all mixed together. In his hand, he clutched a thick manila envelope. I had to find you, he said, his voice cracking. I couldn't let them do this. Not anymore. Do what, sweetheart? What's wrong? He glanced around at the curious diners, then back at me. His gaze was intense. They're all together, Grandma. At Marco's Bistro, just down the street. They've been planning it for weeks. My knees felt weak. I sank back into my chair. The laughter from the next table seemed to mock me. Planning what? Finn's jaw tightened, a gesture so reminiscent of Silas, it sent a pang through my heart. The dinner was a lie. They needed you out of the house tonight. Because of this. He placed the envelope on the table. It landed with a soft, final thud. What is that? I whispered, staring at it as if it were a venomous snake. It's from Grandpa Silas's lawyer. It arrived at Mom's house this afternoon. His voice dropped, becoming a fierce, protective whisper. It's his will, Grandma. And there's something else inside. Something they didn't want you to see. He pulled out the chair that should have been his mother's and sat down. They dragged me to Marco's. Said it was a family strategy meeting about your future. But then I heard them talking. About the lawyer's letter. He pushed the envelope closer to me. Everything is yours, Grandma. The house in Oak Ridge, the stocks, the savings. Grandpa left it all to you. The elegant restaurant seemed to blur at the edges. Well, that's to be expected, isn't it? I'm his wife. Yes, but they didn't expect it. They've been telling everyone, investors, creditors, themselves, that they were the main beneficiaries. Mom was already getting quotes to renovate the Oak Ridge house. Uncle Martin was planning to use the investments to bail out his failing company. Uncle Julian was going to sell off some assets to pay his debts. My mouth was dry. How could they know what was in the will? They didn't, Finn said. They just assumed. But there's more, Grandma. He reached into the envelope again, his hands shaking slightly, and pulled out a set of official-looking papers. They looked like lab results. It's a DNA test, he said, his voice barely audible. Grandpa had it done a year ago. I took the papers. The scientific jargon swam before my eyes, but the conclusion at the bottom was stark and clear, a string of zeros under the column labeled probability of grandparentage. It was a comparison of my DNA, Silas's DNA, and Finn's. I don't understand, I whispered, though a cold, horrifying clarity was beginning to dawn. Finn finally met my eyes, and I saw the profound sadness he'd been holding back. I'm not your grandson, Cora. Not by blood. Mom adopted me when I was an infant. She told you and Grandpa that I was the son of a distant cousin who had died tragically. It was all a lie. The world tilted. The wine glass I was holding slipped from my numb fingers, tipping over and spilling its contents across the white linen. The dark red liquid spread like a wound. My family. My life. my beloved grandson. All of it was built on a foundation of lies. But as I looked into the eyes of this boy, this brave, honest young man who had run through the cold night to find me, who had chosen truth over the comfortable fiction that had defined his entire life, I felt something else. It was not the end of everything. It was the beginning of something real. Finn guided me to the ladies' lounge, where I splashed cold water on my face. The woman in the mirror looked ancient, her carefully applied makeup now a mess of tear-streaked powder and smudged mascara. But her eyes, my eyes, looked different. They looked awake. When we returned to the table, the staff had already replaced the soiled tablecloth and reset my place. I insisted Finn order a full meal. As he ate, he unburdened himself of the story he had carried alone for far too long. I always felt different, he began, nervously tearing a piece of bread. Little things. No one else in the family has my dark hair or my love for drawing. When I had my tonsils out, the doctors asked about family medical history, and Mom got so flustered. She told them my birth parents' records were lost in a fire. The story was always changing. I thought of all the times I had marveled at how unique Finn was, attributing his artistic talent and quiet thoughtfulness to some wonderful, recessive gene. I had been so proud of the ways he stood apart, never suspecting the reason. She used me, he said, his voice laced with a bitterness that no 17-year-old should possess. From the beginning, the story of the tragic orphan cousin was designed to pull at your heartstrings, to make you and Grandpa feel protective and generous. The pieces of a puzzle I never knew I was solving began to click into place. The endless requests for money, tuition for the private art school he'd attended, expensive summer camps, orthodontics, a new laptop for his graphic design classes. Silas and I had paid for it all, happy to provide for our grandson. How much? I asked, my voice hollow. I don't know for sure, he said, shaking his head. But I know it was a lot. Mom used to coach me before we'd visit you. Remember to mention how worn out your coat is, she'd say. Or, tell Grandpa how much that school trip to the museum would mean to you. I was a prop in her long-running play. He looked down at his plate, shamefaced. The worst part is, I loved being with you. It wasn't an act. You and Grandpa were the only ones who ever asked me what I was thinking, what I was dreaming about. You saw me, not just what I could do for you. My heart ached for the little boy who had been taught to perform for affection, all the while craving the real thing that was right there, freely offered. What happened this afternoon? At your mother's house? I asked, steering the conversation back to the present. The letter from Mr. Albright, Grandpa's lawyer, arrived by courier. Mom opened it right away. Her face, it went completely white. Then she called Martin and Julian, and they all started shouting at each other on a conference call. They were furious that Grandpa had left everything to you. And the DNA test? That was in there, too, along with a letter from Grandpa. He explained that he'd become suspicious about some of Mom's stories and had hired a private investigator. The investigator uncovered the truth about my adoption. Grandpa knew for the last year of his life. Silas had known. He had carried this devastating secret, protecting me from it even as the cancer was consuming him. The depth of his love, his silent, steadfast protection, was overwhelming. So, what did they decide to do? I asked, dreading the answer. Finn took a deep breath. That's why I had to come. They're not just angry, Grandma. They're planning to fight. They're meeting with a lawyer tomorrow morning. They're going to contest the will. On what grounds? 2 things. He hesitated, as if reluctant to wound me further. First, they're going to claim Grandpa wasn't of sound mind when he changed the will. But their main strategy, it's you. Me? They're going to try to have you declared mentally incompetent. The words hung in the air, sucking the warmth from the room. My own children. Uncle Martin was saying they could use your grief as evidence that you're not thinking clearly. They'd argue that you're vulnerable, easily manipulated. They plan to petition the court to be appointed as your legal guardians to protect you and your assets. It was diabolical. They would use my love for Silas, my profound sorrow at his loss, as a weapon to strip me of my autonomy. They weren't just after the money. They were after my life, my freedom, my very identity. They were so cold about it, Finn continued, his voice trembling with disgust. They were divvying up responsibilities. Uncle Martin would handle the legal side, Mom would gather anecdotal evidence of your forgetfulness, and Uncle Julian would. I don't know, he just kept agreeing with them. And you? I asked gently. What was their plan for you? Finn's laugh was brittle. I'm their ace in the hole. They plan to paint me as a fraud, and you as my willing victim. They'll argue that your continued affection for me, even after learning the truth, is proof of your diminished capacity. They're going to sacrifice me to get to you. The beautiful thing about having your heart shattered into 1,000 pieces is that there's nothing left to break. The fear I had lived with for years, the fear of my children's disapproval, of their coldness, of being left alone, evaporated. In its place, a quiet, unshakable resolve began to form. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness for the last time. I looked at Finn, this boy who was not my blood but was more my family than any of them. He had risked everything, his home, his security, the only mother he had ever known, to warn me. He had shown up. Finn, I said, and my voice was no longer the trembling whisper of a victim. It was calm and clear. How would you feel about spending the night at my house? We have a lot to do tomorrow. For the first time all evening, a genuine smile touched his lips. I'd like that, Grandma. I'd like that very much. I motioned for the waiter. Could we have the check, please? And a box for my grandson's dinner. We have an early start tomorrow. As we left the warm glow of the silver pen and stepped into the cold, clear night, I felt a strange sense of liberation. My children had abandoned me, but they had also set me free. They thought they were a day away from taking everything from me. They had no idea that Silas, my quiet, steadfast Silas, had been planning for this day for a very long time. And he had left me everything I needed to fight back. The next morning, I woke with a purpose I hadn't felt since before Silas's illness. Finn was asleep on the sofa, wrapped in Silas's old woolen blanket, looking younger and more vulnerable than the brave young man he had been the night before. I made coffee and, at precisely 9 o'clock, I called Mr. Albright's office. Mrs. Hemlock, I'm so glad you called, his secretary said, her voice warm with familiarity. Mr. Albright was hoping you'd be in touch. He has some additional materials from your husband to share with you. An hour later, Finn and I were sitting in the same leather chairs my children had occupied 2 days prior. Mr. Albright, a kind man with silver hair and eyes that had seen a lifetime of family disputes, slid a large, sealed box across his mahogany desk. Silas called this his contingency plan, he explained gently. He stipulated it was only to be opened by you, in my presence, if any of the children contested the will or made any move to question your competence. Their phone call to my office yesterday morning triggered that condition. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was not just paperwork, but a meticulously organized collection of evidence. There were audio recorders, photo albums, and spiral-bound ledgers. Silas was a methodical man, Mr. Albright said with a sad smile. He began to worry about 18 months ago. He said the children's requests for money had become more predatory. He started documenting everything. The first thing I pulled out was a photograph. It showed Isabel, beaming, standing beside a brand-new luxury SUV. The date stamp was from the week she had called me in tears, claiming she couldn't afford to fix her old car and needed $5,000 for a down payment on a reliable, used vehicle. Next was a printout of Martin's social media, showing him and his wife on a lavish trip to the Caribbean, posted just days after he'd borrowed $15,000 from us. Money he'd claimed was to cover a sudden tax shortfall that threatened his business. Then, Mr. Albright handed me a small digital audio player and a set of earbuds. Silas began recording his phone calls with them. He told them his hearing was getting poor, and he needed to amplify the calls. He was a clever man. I pressed play. It was a conversation from a few months before Silas died. Dad, we're just worried about Mom, Isabel's voice said, slick with false concern. She seems so fragile since your diagnosis. We think it might be time to get power of attorney, just to help her with the bills. It would be one less thing for her to worry about. Your mother is perfectly capable of paying her own bills, Silas's voice replied, firm but weary. Of course she is, Martin chimed in smoothly. But this is about planning for the future. making things easier down the line. We could set up a trust, have one of us as a co-signatory on her accounts. It's the responsible thing to do. I listened for nearly an hour as my children, one by one, laid out their strategy to systematically strip me of my independence, all under the guise of loving concern. They spoke of me as if I were a child, a problem to be managed, an asset to be controlled. When the recordings finished, I was numb. Finn, who had been listening with me on a second set of earbuds, simply shook his head in disgust. "There's one more thing," Mr. Albright said, pulling a slim, leather-bound journal from the box. "Silas's final instructions. And a letter for you." I opened the journal. It was Silas's handwriting, clear and steady. The pages contained not a will, but a roadmap. He had anticipated every legal maneuver my children might attempt. He had preemptively gathered affidavits from our doctor, our friends, and our neighbors testifying to my sharp mind and sound judgment. He had established a trust that would be managed by an independent third party, but which gave me sole, unrestricted access to the funds. And he had included a no-contest clause of ironclad strength. Any heir who challenged the will would be automatically and irrevocably disinherited. Tucked into the last page was a sealed envelope. For my Cora, it read. I opened it, my heart aching. My dearest Cora, if you are reading this, it means the worst has happened, and our children have finally shown their true colors. I am more sorry than I can say that you have to face this without me. For years, I watched them chip away at your spirit. I saw how their casual cruelty and bottomless entitlement wounded you. I should have put a stop to it long ago, but I knew you loved them and I couldn't bear to force you to choose. But know this, my love, their failings are not yours. You gave them a universe of love, and they saw it only as a gold mine. You are not weak. You are the strongest person I have ever known. Your capacity for love and forgiveness is a superpower, not a flaw. They were simply not worthy of it. I have done everything in my power to protect you. The money is yours. The house is yours. Your life is yours. Do not let them bully you, or guilt you, or manipulate you into giving them one more inch of your peace. You owe them nothing. I also know the truth about Finn. The boy has more integrity and heart than the three of them combined. He is family in the only way that matters. I've set up a separate educational trust for him. The details are in the safe at the Oak Ridge house. The combination is the date we met. Live, Cora. Live for both of us. Go to Italy like we always planned. Plant that garden you've always wanted. Fill the house with friends and laughter. You have spent a lifetime taking care of everyone else. Now it is your turn. You are, and always will be, the great love of my life. Yours forever, Silas. Tears streamed down my face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, aching love for the man who had seen me, known me, and loved me so completely. He hadn't just left me an inheritance, he had left me a fortress. He had left me my freedom. I looked at Finn, then at Mr. Albright. I folded the letter and placed it carefully in my handbag. Mr. Albright, I said, my voice clear and strong. I believe my children are expecting to meet with their lawyer this morning. Would you be so kind as to contact him? Please inform him that any and all legal challenges will be met with the full force of the evidence my husband prepared. And let him know that as of this moment, my children are no longer welcome in my home or in my life. I stood up, feeling taller than I had in years. Come on, Finn, I said, taking his arm. Let's go home. To Oak Ridge. The 6 months that followed were a quiet renaissance. The Oak Ridge house, which I had once associated with lonely weekends, became my sanctuary. With Finn's help, I began to clear out the silence. We filled the rooms with music, with the scent of baking bread, and with the comfortable clutter of living. Finn finished his final year of high school at the local Oak Ridge school, thriving in an environment where he was seen for his talent and wit, not his utility. He was accepted into a prestigious art college in the city, his tuition fully covered by the trust Silas had so thoughtfully established. We found the deed Silas had mentioned in his letter. He had purchased the small, wooded lot next to our property. His plan had been to build a small studio for me, a place where I could paint, a passion I had set aside decades ago to raise a family. Now, with Finn's help, we were building it. He designed it, a beautiful, light-filled space with a large stone fireplace, and I oversaw the construction, feeling a thrill of creation I hadn't realized I was missing. My children had tried, of course. After their lawyer received Mr. Albright's communication, the legal threats evaporated, replaced by a desperate barrage of phone calls, letters, and even unannounced visits. Isabel sent tearful, rambling emails. Martin left blustering, angry voicemails. Julian sent cards with pleading, childish scrawls. They didn't understand. I wasn't punishing them. I was simply done. I was a book they had finished reading, and I was closing the cover. My story was moving on, and they were no longer a part of it. My new life was populated by a different kind of family, one built on shared interests and mutual respect. There was Eleanor, my next-door neighbor, a sharp-witted widow with whom I now shared a weekly walk and a bottle of wine. There was Mr. Gable from the local nursery, who was helping me plan the garden Silas had wanted me to have. There was Finn's art teacher, who often came for dinner, and my small book club, which met in my living room once a month. One crisp autumn evening, Finn and I were sitting on the porch of the main house, looking over at the nearly completed studio. The frame was up, a skeleton of promise against the fiery sunset. "Do you ever miss them?" he asked quietly, his sketchbook open on his lap. I considered the question for a moment, letting the cool air wash over me. "I miss the idea of them," I said honestly. "I miss the children I thought I had. But the people they became? No, I don't miss them. I mourn them." He nodded, understanding. "Grandma Cora," he began, his pencil stilling on the page. "I know I'm not, by blood." I reached over and placed my hand over his. His skin was warm, his hand strong. "Finn," I said, looking into his dark, earnest eyes. Silas was right. Family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up. It's about who chooses to love you and who you choose to love back. It's about who helps you build a new porch when the old one is rotten. A real smile, bright and unburdened, lit up his face. "In that case," he said, "I think our family is pretty great." "I think so, too," I said, my heart full. The sky had deepened to a velvety blue, and the first stars were appearing over the lake. The air was getting colder, but I didn't feel it. I was wrapped in a warmth that no amount of money could buy, the quiet, steady warmth of a life rebuilt, of peace earned, and of a love that was, finally, real. I was no longer the ivy, drifting without its oak. I had learned to stand on my own, and in doing so, had grown roots deeper and stronger than I had ever thought possible.